So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's a real pleasure to be here and to refer to what Carlos was just saying. A very warm thank you to the team, Maria, Anna, Isabel, Rita, for putting together this working CLIL session today, and a very warm thank you to you, actually, as has been said, for giving up a Saturday for a session. So I have a presentation here of about 40 minutes, and it's a reflection on where we're going now with CLIL. And somebody's actually helping me in Porto with the presentation, changing the slides. So you'll just have to bear with me, or bear with us as we go through the presentation. And as you know yourselves, almost all of you will have been using Zoom and Blackboard and other platforms. Sometimes it's not entirely easy, but today it's going to go like a dream. So we'll take the next slide. The situation with language education seems to have become an ever greater imperative, especially over the last 10 years. There are three major reasons for this. One is the need for people to learn certain languages. Often it's English, but others as well. A second one is for students to develop global competencies, which are made easier if they learn languages. And the third one is health. And we're going to touch on all of these three today in this presentation. And what we can see globally is that there's a great need to improve how people learn languages. We spend many hours teaching languages in schools and colleges around the world, from Taiwan to Belfast. That's not a, yeah, Belfast, and to Porto here in Finland. But people are looking for different ways of doing it in terms not only of teaching what has been called foreign languages, but also teaching heritage, minority languages, and also teaching migrants, incoming migrants into countries, the dominant language of the environment. So people around the world are looking at the question of, can we do better? You know, can we actually do better in giving more young people better competencies in the languages that we teach? And today we're going to visit Mexico and Finland and Brazil to have a look at what's happening there. And I'm going to give some examples of the situation in those countries, some projects. But before we do that, the OECD PISA Global Competencies is one framework which describes the kinds of competencies that young people need for their working lives in the present and in the future. There have been many of these over the last 15 years, but this is the one that I personally prefer because it is so simple, and within it, it's possible to really understand how we can and how we should change curricula and change the way that we teach subjects, including languages, which are actually a major part of achieving global competencies. So if we take the next slide, what's happening out there is we're seeing processes of integration. Integration as in taking things that already work, but actually putting them together in different ways. It's not so much inventing new ways of teaching languages that we can see, but there are interesting developments where integration is happening. The birth of CLIL was a very basic form of integration. We were integrating a language with content. But what we see now is we see, because of the pressure to develop language learning globally, we can see interesting examples of integration happening all over the world. So if we turn to the next slide, and we'll go first to Mexico. This is a story concerning 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds who have studied languages for some years, whose competence in the languages is very, very low, and who, in order to change them around, a project was set up which put the content into language teaching. Now, in Mexico, as in other countries, in the public sector, public school sector, there are very few teachers who are actually able to use, in this case, English, in order to develop quite sophisticated CLIL models. So what we've done is we've actually created materials for the language teachers, which are heavily dedicated to content. And we've created those materials so that actually the students have a sufficient scaffolding within the materials in order to navigate the content. So we've designed CLIL materials for 15, 16-year-olds. The first year of these materials, that's the first year of high school, the main focus is to de-school their negative inheritance or memory of learning, in this case, English, because the teaching of English at primary level has not succeeded. It has damaged what we call the affective filter after Stephen Krashen, and it has made the young people not feel confident about learning English and not really even think that it's worth it. So this project was one where we took topics that we knew were of interest for the students produced the topics, and then we created 30-hour modules for the students to learn content through English on the topics that they had. The result has been overwhelmingly positive. Has it been positive in terms of teaching them English? Hard to tell. Has it been positive in terms of changing their attitude towards themselves as learners of English? Yes. Has it been a project which has shown that they can achieve complex tasks in English? Yes, it has. Can we take the next slide, please? This project in the second year moves into developing global competencies, but at the same time taking very simple topics like happiness. And goodness knows, we all need a bit of happiness in life. But this particular module, which is also about putting content into language teaching, takes the topic of happiness, but approaches it from perspectives which are in the existing curriculum. Okay, related to psychology, related to a whole load of variants in different subjects such as geography, maths, and physics. So the language teacher controls the situation. The materials are sort of self-learning materials because the scaffolding is so strong, including the use of translanguaging so that the students are able to learn in their first language, which is usually Spanish, and in English. And again, in 30 hours, the results have been overwhelmingly good, because if you can change, if you can open the affective filter and you can provide language learning experiences related to language acquisition, then this seems to be proven in this particular project as having worked even in conditions where the classes may have 50 or 60 students, and in conditions where the attitude towards English may not be terribly favorable, and so on and so on. So a remarkably interesting example of CLIL in action in a demanding environment. Could we take the next slide? Another project which has been operating in Mexico relates to the content teachers. So what happens is a group of teachers are asked to volunteer to join a project, and the project is about teaching global awareness, global competencies. Those teachers are volunteers and they may come from any subjects. Some of those content teachers will not be able to speak English, but they want to join the team because they see it as an innovation team in terms of the methods which are being used to teach this content to the students whose English language levels are very low. So this is an example of putting language into content teaching. The content teachers actually work with the materials. They often use Spanish alongside English. A deal is made with the students as to whether they want to join this and if they want to use English. And the results of this have been very, very interesting, particularly not so much in terms of the English, but they've been really interesting in terms of having teachers in schools work together, sometimes for the first time, in teams and developing methodologies. If they had not had the CLIL or the English, this probably would never have happened. And the results of this is to empower the students to work with the teachers in order to learn the content. And it's all been related to ZPD. It's all been related to producing tasks which are intelligent, tasks which are demanding, but tasks that are within reach of the students if they have sufficient support and scaffolding. Okay, to Finland. Surprisingly warm today here in Finland. Finland has, as you know, and I'm sure it drives you mad, has been basically at the top of the world for a long time in terms of educational success, especially with 15, 16-year-olds as measured in PISA. Now, one of the most, what's been happening over the last 5 years is that the Finnish global figures on PISA have been starting to go down. So in order to regenerate the curriculum, something has been introduced called phenomenon-based learning. Phenomenon-based learning, which is a sophisticated form of project-based learning. But let me just explain to you how it works, because it's also an interesting vehicle for introducing CLIL. You take a subject like lightning and you study it from very different perspectives. In the case of lightning, it could be through physics, it could be through maths, it could be through geography, it could be through art, and it could be through English. And what they do if they do this using CLIL is that they put this together as a team, and the students study quite demanding content, content that is in the curricula of physics, maths, geography, art. And they do this work in English, and sometimes they blend it in Finnish in order to create intellectually a very interesting experience. Could we take the next slide? The reason why phenomenon-based learning or 360 learning has been introduced right through the Finnish curriculum from primary to secondary is, as I said, because educators in Finland said, we need to strengthen the development of global competencies. Okay, we actually need to do that. And the way to do that is to develop what we call systems thinking. Systems thinking is seeing patterns and seeing the interdependency of things in life. It's like looking at this lake and thinking it's an ecosystem, okay? So if we do something to this lake, if we feed the fish with the wrong food, if we contaminate the lake, if we drain the lake, it will have an impact on other things. So that whole intellectual process of problem solving at a most sophisticated level is called systems thinking, and that is part of the experimental work, well, no longer experimental work, of the curricular work which is now being done in Finland and which works really well if it is done partly or wholly in an additional language. And in this case, in Finland at the moment, it's English. The next slide, please. Our systems have been really good at teaching what is called crystallized intelligence. And that is basically like the student becomes like an encyclopedia of knowledge. And we teach the knowledge, and then we test that they know the knowledge. And this is very much focused on what is called crystallized intelligence. But modern problem solving, global competencies require something called fluid intelligence as well. And the biggest driving force in terms of modernizing the way that we teach languages and other subjects is to focus really heavily on developing this fluid intelligence. And to do this, it requires different types of curricular project. It requires different types of methodologies and activities, and it requires the attitude of the teachers that, hey, yes, this is good, and this is something that I want to do. And what we found in Mexico and what we can see in Finland is that one of the most important driving forces here is the attitude of the teachers, who see that these kinds of integration really do work and really do have an impact. There are things that block innovation, such as exams, but in these cases, in Mexico and in Finland, the exam structures were being modified to accommodate the innovation. Could we take the next slide, please? Let's go to Brazil. Imagine you have a problem, which is widespread monolingualism, okay? And you have, as in the case of Brazil, you have a separation into private sector schools and public sector schools, and the private sector schools, which can be very expensive, are hiring the teachers who, in the case of Brazil, who can actually speak in another language, namely English, because the hunger for English amongst Brazilian parents, Brazilian young people, is so high. So you have a kind of a social equity issue. Now, what we can see happening in Brazil is a lot of very brilliant people who are saying, hey, we can teach languages in a different way. And one of the ways that they are doing is to say, we need to integrate in certain ways. We have a problem. Our language teachers sometimes our language teachers of English do not have a very good command of English. That's not a Brazilian thing. That's true actually right across the world in the public sector. And we have a problem because our subject teachers can't speak English. How can we introduce CLIL into a school without spending a lot of money and time teaching languages to the teachers and teaching them how to use bilingual methodologies like CLIL methodologies? Can we take the next one? So what they're doing is they're saying, we will produce a package which the students can use, a sort of gamification package, which is linked to the curriculum. Okay, so it's linked to the curriculum for teaching geography or history or physics, but which provides the students with an immersive experience to learn about that topic through English. Why? Because we can't wait for the language teaching to change. We can't wait for the subject teaching to change. The demand is there for the English now. The demand for equity is there now to make sure that the public sector kids have the same opportunities as private sector. So let's have a look at what we have here. So there are various technological solutions happening in Brazil, as in other places, which are producing immersive experiences. What happens in the class is, if you're in a language class or you're in a content class, the class runs ahead as normal. And for about 15 or 20 minutes, maybe 10, the students use their mobile phones, they use the glasses, and they go into an immersive environment where they can ask questions and they can communicate with a kind of a mysterious oracle from outer space. Could we just try and show this video just to show you 1 minute of that, what that experience is? This is about a journey to Mars. So they've been studying Mars in their curriculum. The language teaching has been providing some understanding of key words about the planetary system. And then the kids have 10 to 15 minutes alone on their journey to Mars. Now, this is the frightening bit where we wait to see if the video works.
You slept the whole trip from Earth. You look a little dizzy. Probably the change of air pressure affected your systems. In the countdown of 3, 2, 1. Welcome to Mars.
Thank you,
Did you know that
team.
Mars was named by the ancient Romans for their god of war?
Thank you, team. That worked perfectly. We go back to the PowerPoint. We are seeing young people, Generation Z, who are already now getting quite old, Generation A, who are remarkably different to children of, let's say, 15 years ago because of their exposure to digital technologies. Now, we know all the problems with with young people. They might be our own children or our students, resulting from an increasing amount of time spent in the digital world. But the fact is that the preferred ways of thinking are being influenced by games and by various other aspects of that experience. So the Brazilian experiment is a matter of taking the gamification world into the curriculum through English using CLIL with heavy scaffolding built in, but providing that young person with an opportunity to explore what was learned in the curriculum through English in their world. And it's a very interesting one. The Mexican work was a form of integration which was taking issues which are important in the minds of 15, 16-year-old Mexican young people and linking those to the outside world and actually preparing materials for them to learn successfully in content classes and in language classes. The Finnish work is very much in Finland, where the standard of being able to speak English is very high. Okay, the Finnish work is about going the next step, which is saying, actually, now we've achieved so much in terms of having a bilingual young people that we now need to utilize this Finnish English language knowledge and awareness to go the next step, which is to develop systems thinking. Let's have a look at the situation with the lockdown in order to wrap up this first presentation today. We've been suffering a lot, all of us, and it has been an extraordinary year. And I think it's wonderful that we actually can pull together as a community of teachers and a community of people and look for the positive in a world where there have been just so many negatives. If you look at the experiences of young people who have been learning from home, who have had remote teaching, remote learning, whatever we call it, there's not much good news. Because if the standards of teaching, whether it was teaching language or teaching content, were poor before, they were amplified in many cases when these same teachers switched to remote teaching, except for those who were developing CLIL. And I want to very briefly come to this point, if I may, having just had a look at some of the negatives relating to the experience that we have. We've got students feeling isolated, we've got students feeling disconnected, and we've got students feeling alone on a greater scale than when they were in our classrooms. The next slide, please. We've got students who, if they miss a point when the teacher is talking, there's no way they can catch up. If they were in class, they could just have a look at the notes of the student next to them, or they could maybe communicate non-verbally to the teacher that they're lost, and then the teacher would be able to immediately respond. But with remote teaching, there's what we call a cognitive fog, which is quite commonplace. The next slide, please. We've got reduced feedback. It's very hard for teachers to give feedback when they're teaching remotely. And there's very little space for what we call feed forward. Feed forward being constructive guidance on how to do better because of the basic disconnect of the technology. And the next slide, please. Physical well-being, we've already been facing problems, for example, in Europe with young people, especially females, in terms of a whole range of issues relating to probably the digital lifestyle plus. But now those problems have again been amplified. And the next slide, please. And then we have higher levels of stress when learning remotely than when in class, due to anxiety about testing and so on and so on. So ladies and gentlemen, COVID-19 has brought us a situation which has been absolutely horrendous in many of our countries and continues to be so. But it has also given us in education an opportunity, in a way, to undergo an experiment in teaching. And that experiment has shown us the weaknesses that there are when teaching remotely. And it's enabled us to think about, well, actually, how many of these weaknesses were already there in when we were doing physical presence classroom? The next slide, please. Methods, methods, methods. How do I do CLIL? What is CLIL? CLIL has invited a whole range of different models where language is integrated with content. Those models have only been successful so far as the capacity, the capability, and the belief of the teacher that it's worthwhile, which is an absolutely paramount importance in terms of any success, but also in terms of the methods that are being used. Now, when was CLIL formed? It was like 25 years ago. It was a long time ago. In those days, those educators who came to get together and said, we can do better, they were looking at what are the methods, what are the activities that we can do to blend the experience of language learning as a subject with the experience of language acquisition. How can we actually do this? Now, when we look at the methods, could we take the next slide? When we look at these methods, let's think about some of these methods that we can see in CLIL classrooms. We have scaffolding, one of the most important words in any education. It doesn't matter if you're teaching in the first language or in the second language, but what we know is that when you're teaching in a second language, we need more and varied forms of scaffolding. And we know that the digital world, the games world, the world, that cyberspace world is full of scaffolding, which is why and how young people can navigate and play these sophisticated things that they do. Conceptual dualism relates to translanguaging. Conceptual dualism means that we learning something in English, but we are reflecting on it in the first language, or we are harnessing the first language to support the thinking in English, because it's not learning English words that's the key issue in CLIL. It's getting access to thinking in English. And when we're thinking in English, we are not suddenly in a monolingual world of English in our mind. We're actually drawing on the Portuguese, we're drawing on the first language, and conceptual dualism has become a very powerful activity. Formative evaluation, I think that's one of the secrets of Finnish success. It is that the evaluation is continuous, and that in terms of the remote teaching, it's a matter of guessing how are we going to do this. It's a matter of the little competitions and tests that kind of guessing how we're doing and how we might do and so on. reciprocal teaching, feed-forward, and translanguaging. Now, when we look at these, which are fairly commonplace in CLIL classrooms, and when we look at the experience of remote teaching, these are those things that are actually migrating from having been done in physical presence classroom and work well in terms of remote teaching. So all in all, the integration that we have been developing within the CLIL community has actually worked well in this new, highly stressful, highly difficult environment where, as we saw with the red traffic lights, there are so many negatives, but there are solutions which some of us who've been developing in these in CLIL have managed to acquire. The next slide, please. I mentioned that the third reason why languages are so important at the moment, or why they're being discussed so much. In some countries, there are moves to basically stop language teaching. And I'm thinking here of some of the English-speaking countries, because they say, everybody speaks English, we don't need to waste time learning other languages. And other people say, look, within 5 years, we'll have automated interpretation, translation, digital processes, and we don't need to learn languages. The most important reason why we should do CLIL, and the most important reason why we should teach different languages relates to the mind and brain. This is not a question of playing with myths, languages are good for you. It's becoming increasingly absolutely evidence-based that thinking in another language brings cognitive benefits which a monolingual would not have. I believe educators, you can go all the way back to Plato, have known this intuitively, because elite education in different parts of, for example, Europe, have always involved learning languages. But you know, if you look at 150 years ago, if you look at France, Germany, Italy, Britain, Spain, Portugal, when those elites sent their children to learn another language from Portugal to France or from France to England or whatever, they didn't put them in language teaching lessons. They put them in environments where, immersive environments, where the students, the young people, learned the language by doing. And in a very, very simple way, that's what we're trying to replicate when we teach CLIL in our classrooms before COVID, in fact, during COVID, and now in the future, I think it will become ever more important, because the evidence showing what they call the bilingual advantage is overwhelmingly powerful. And the most exciting thing, I think, for us in a community such as this one, working CLIL, is that those benefits kick in very quickly if the student is thinking in the language. And as we can see from Mexico, from Brazil, and also from Finland, these advantages, this thinking in another language can come very quickly if the materials are scaffolded and structured right, and if the methods enable the students to activate the learning of the language and the learning through the language at the same time. The next slide, please. Where are we going with this COVID? We don't know, but it seems that we're going to be teaching hybrid programs or teaching online possibly for another 6 months. It's very, very possible. So I think, you know, with all the tragedy and all the sadness, it is actually an opportunity to say to ourselves, what am I doing now when I'm teaching online? If we're teaching through another language like English, how do these methods, how can I strengthen these activities and these methods when I come back to class and when this awful business is over? Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you this morning.